design of this colored stone ring contains an oval center stone and two side diamonds. By constructing this mounting using findings, you can make this ring for a variety of different size stones that your customer may have. In addition, using the techniques described here, you can make this ring with one side diamond on each side, as we are doing, or with 2, 3, or more diamonds on each side. To make this colored stone ring, we use 4 component findings and a piece of flat gold stock. We need a 14-karat yellow gold shank, a 14-karat yellow gold heavy-bottomed basket crown for the oval center stone, 2 14-karat white gold tall prong crowns for the 2 side stones, and a piece of 14-karat yellow gold stock 1 millimeter thick by 2 millimeters wide. For this ring has a number of different shanks that could be used. I like the airline on the shank for this type of ring because it blends in, making a nice transition from the shank to the side stone basket crowns. The oval center basket crown is heavier than the normal wire basket crowns that are made for pendants and earrings. These are made for rings with a wide heavy bottom bezel to create the top of the ring shank, and the prong wire is a little thicker than a normal basket crown to withstand the extra wear and tear that will be received from wearing the ring. The side crowns are extended prong crowns or a cast basket crown with the prongs extending down below the gallery. These long prongs provide a lot of options to work with to make a piece of jewelry that looks like a nice hand-fabricated piece when finished, rather than a small die-stuck crown that looks like it's just stuck on to the side of the ring. The first step in making this ring is to take the oval center crown and clean it up. File the bottom flat. Then file around the side where the sprue was clipped off and blend it into the base of the crown and shape the bottom of the prong. We need to file these little pads off the side of the crown. These pads are made on this crown to solder a solid shank directly to the base. We're going to use a little different style of shank and add side stones, so these pads are in our way and we need to remove them. Thread a saw blade through the crown and saw the top of the pad off. You want to be sure to saw a straight line even with the bottom bezel. Once you saw the one side, turn it around and saw the other side. You need to be careful as you're sawing to make sure that your saw blade does not cut into the crown on the bottom side. You just want to cut the pad on the top side. When you finish sawing, take a file and file a flat spot on the sides of the crown. File the bottom bezel where we cut the pad off and the round wire under bezel. We want a flat spot here for our side diamond crown. Then take a fine cut needle file and remove the saw marks and smooth the bottom bezel where we remove the pad. Next, we need to take our millimeter gauge and measure the width of our side crowns and transfer that measurement to our gold stock. By measuring the width of the crown with a millimeter gauge and then tightening the thumb screw, we will keep the jaws open at the right dimension, and then we can use a millimeter gauge to scribe onto our gold stock. We need 2 pieces at least this long. A little longer is fine. To cut our gold stock, we alter our bench pin slightly by cutting a little notch into the bench pin. Cut straight down into the bench pin about a millimeter deep so that you create a lip, a line closest to us in the wood, and then taper the notch away from us. This little groove will hold our gold stock from sliding around and allow us to cut easily and cleanly. Using a saw, cut the pieces of the gold stock. We want to cut until we're almost through, but not quite all the way through. If we cut all the way through, the little piece of gold stock can fly across the shop and they would be easy to lose. So by cutting almost through and then breaking the piece off with our fingers helps us from losing the little piece of gold that we cut. Hold the piece in a pair of pliers and file across the end to remove the little lip that is left where we broke it off. Then take the shank and clean the ends. This piece that we cut is going to extend the bottom finger on the shank. On this shank, the bottom finger and the top finger extend the same length. We need the bottom finger to extend further to allow room for the side diamonds to fit. Use 14-karat yellow gold hard solder to attach the gold piece to the shank. Place the piece of gold that we cut in a pair of locking tweezers and use it to pick up a little ball of solder on the end. Then, with our ring shank clamped in locking tweezers, position the piece of gold in place and heat the shank to flow the solder across the seam, attaching the additional piece of gold solidly onto the shank. Flip the shank over and pick up the second piece of gold and attach it to the bottom finger of the shank in the same manner. Whenever you solder gold, you want to be sure to coat it with boric acid and alcohol. The boric acid will create a glassy coating on the gold to keep it from oxidizing, and it also makes it easier for the solder to flow. Once cooled, clean off the boric acid and flux, and then use a file to remove any excess solder and to blend the piece of gold into the shank, so the bottom finger of the shank looks like one solid piece of gold on both sides. Be sure to turn the shank around and use your half-round file to file the inside finger hole smooth, again removing any excess solder and blending the piece of gold into the ring shank. Then use a little needle file to get inside the airline. Using a very fine file will make it easier to clean up the file marks later. Then use a snap-on sanding disc to smooth out the gold and to remove any of our file marks. Sand inside the airline and on the sides of the shank to smooth this all out and to remove any file marks. This is a die-struck shank, so on the sides of the shank you will see marks from the die that stamped out this ring, and so we use our sanding disc at this time to remove any of those tool marks as well. Then use a silicone rubber abrasive wheel to clean the inside of the shank and remove any file marks from inside the finger hole. We want the shank nice and round, and the two additional fingers that we extended onto the ring shank needs to be shaped round and even with the rest of the ring. As you can see here, they stick up a little bit on the ends, and so we need to bend them around. To do that, we use a hammer and punch. Place the punch on the very tip of the finger and tap it lightly to bend it down tight onto the ring mandrel. And now you can see we have the ring shaped to make a perfect circle tight against the ring mandrel. Next, take a bristle brush and polish the ring shank inside the airline. Once we assemble the ring, it will be difficult to access the inside of this airline, so it's a lot easier to polish it now. Next, we need to make notches for the prongs of the side crowns. We begin making that notch with our saw. Make a notch on the bottom finger in line with the very edge of the top finger. Guide your saw blade so that it goes from the top finger through the center point of the ring shank. We want a line that will closely intersect the very center of the ring. Just cut into the shank the depth of the saw blade. We just want a little notch here so that when we use our burr to cut the round notch for the prong, it will stay in a straight line. We then use a tapered cylinder burr called a Krause burr to cut this notch on the bottom finger. Place the burr in the notch made with the saw blade and cut down into the shank so that we have a round hole the same size as the wire prong on the side crowns. Once we cut this on all four sides, we need to test fit our side crown. To do so, we need to trim the length of two of the prongs with our end cutters. Don't cut very much off, just a couple of millimeters, a little more than the thickness of our gold on the bottom shank. We can then use this crown with the clipped prongs to slide the two longest prongs down into the notches to see if they fit. If we did not cut deep enough and the prongs will not fit down, we need to cut a little deeper with our Krause burr. It's always better to cut these notches shallow to begin with and go back and recut them a little deeper than to cut them too large in the beginning. Test fit them again, and as you can see here, these prongs fit nicely into the notches. We then bring our center crown up and hold it to see if the angle of the side crown matches the same angle as the center crown. Now we need to mark the bottom finger of the shank where the second set of prongs will intersect the bottom finger. Hold the side crown in place and using the point of a tweezer, mark the bottom shank where the prong meets the bottom finger of the shank. This will tell us where we need to make our notches. Once we marked all 4 prongs in this way, we again take our saw and cut a little notch on the line that we scribed. This notch will give our burr a guide to start cutting. If we did not make this notch, the burr can walk across the gold and cut our notch in the wrong place and mar the surface of the shank. We then go back to our crow spur and finish making the notch for the second set of prongs. Now we can take our side crowns and slide them in and make sure everything is nice and straight. Again, check the angle of the crown with the angle of the center crown to make sure it's all slanting away from the bottom at the same angle so the center crown will fit nice and tight between the 2 side crowns. And there we have both side crowns in place. They're held in place just by the friction of the prongs on the bottom finger of the shank. You can see the finger on the one side is a little bit long. It extends out past the prongs of the side crown. So take your saw and cut the finger flush with the side of the prongs. It's always better to leave it just a little bit long in the beginning because you can always cut it off at this time. Remove the side crowns off the shank and place the center crown in between the bottom fingers of the shank. Hold it in place with the head shank tweezers and make sure everything is lined up nice and straight. Then solder it on with 14-karat medium flow solder. Do not use hard solder here because the heat would cause the first joint to melt and we don't want that little piece of gold that we added to fly out. So we're soldering it on with medium solder and attaching the shank on both sides to the center crown. Again, we coat everything with boric acid and alcohol to keep the ring from oxidizing. Once soldered, use a half-round ring file to file the inside of the ring shank to remove any excess solder and to blend the center crown into the shank to make it look like it's all one piece. Slide it onto a ring mandrel and using our nylon-faced hammer, tap on the sides of the ring shank to straighten it out and to make the ring round and symmetrical. Then we go back to the crow spur and clean out any excess solder that flowed into the little notches that we created for the side prongs. Next, we take the side crowns and slip them in place. Make sure that they fit and everything is lined up straight. We then coat the entire ring with boric acid and alcohol and solder the side crowns in place with easy flow 14-karat yellow gold solder. First, solder the side crown directly to the under bezel of the center. It's important that the side stone fits up tight against the center crown. We could have soldered the side crowns to the shank first and then put the center crown in place, but it's a little better to solder the center crown in first and then you can put the side crowns and pull it tight against the center crown. If necessary, use a little pair of hand tweezers to pull it in against the center crown. If our side crown pulls away from the top finger of the shank, we can always add a little piece of gold extending the top finger of the shank, but we do not want a gap between the side crown and the center crown. If there is a gap there, it will hold the side stone out from the center stone and the ring will not look as nice. Once we have the side crowns soldered to the under bezel of the center crown, we then solder them to the top finger of the ring shank, once again using easy flow solder. Now that the side crowns are in place, we can clip off the bottom of the prongs that extend down into the finger hole. Don't cut these too short. Leave a little bit of a nub past the inside of the shank. We want to trim these down as it makes it easier to solder rather than having the wire stick up in the way, so we clip these off with a pair of end cutters. Then recoat the ring with boric acid and alcohol and use easy flow 14-karat yellow gold solder to solder the ends of the wire prongs to the shank. Go around and solder each of the 8 prongs solid to the shank with a very small piece of solder. Make sure that the solder flows completely between the prong and the shank, and also the side where the prongs are in contact with the shank. Once we are finished soldering, we again clean the boric acid and flux off, and using our half-round file, clean up the inside of the shank, filing the remainder of the prongs off, and clean any excess solder from the inside of the ring. We then use a fine-cut needle file and file the excess solder off, filing the side of the shank to a sharp line where the shank and prong intersect. Then file around the prong, rolling your wrist to keep the round shape of the prong. Clean up the ring so everything looks nice and sharp. Then use our needle file to clean the top where the crown and the top finger of the shank was soldered. Remove any excess solder and blend the shank into the side of the crown. Then use an abrasive rubber cylinder to remove file marks from the inside of the ring shank. Then use a knife-edge pumice wheel to remove the file marks from the sides of the crown and the shank. Then use a bristle brush to polish and remove all the emery marks. We want to do this at the bench with a small bristle brush because you can get down into areas between the prongs and all the areas where it will be difficult to reach with a big buff wheel. Then use a little cylinder heartfelt wheel to polish the inside of the center crown. Leaving the inside of this crown rough just detracts from the overall appearance of the ring. It only takes a few seconds to polish this, and it just makes your work that much better. It's that little extra that makes ordinary work into extraordinary. Then take a small hard felt wheel and go around the outside of the crowns. It's easier to get the edge of this wheel down along the edge of the prongs and between the prongs on the bottom and under bezel, and to polish the sides of the shank flat. Then polish at the buffing machine, and the ring is now assembled, ready to set the stones.